Good day and welcome to Lightning EV Talk, Lightning eMotors podcast on all things commercial electric vehicles. My name is Nick Bettis. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Sales Operations here at Lightning eMotors, and I'm joined today by Ross Reida, our Director of Customer Financing. How you doing today, Ross?
Doing great, Nick. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. All right. So Lightning EV Talk is a forum about bringing people, thought leaders internally and externally to Lightning eMotors together to talk about all aspects of commercial fleet electrification. This might be business aspects, technical aspects, any kind of information that would be critical to a fleet's implementation of a successful implementation of an electrified fleet. Today, we're going to be talking about what we call the fleet electrification equation. This is a 6-part webcast or podcast series, and this is just the one piece of that, and it's for the financing component. So the 6 components to a successful deployment revolve around selecting the right vehicles, selecting and implementing the right charging infrastructure, software, telematics software, financing, funding, grant opportunities, and then, of course, supporting and servicing those vehicles after the purchase. We have a podcast on each of those topics, and we hope you'll take the time to go ahead and take a look at those at a later date. But today, we're going to talk about financing in particular, and I'm just thrilled to have Ross on our team now to help our customers through this process of figuring out what the best avenues to acquiring these vehicles is from a financial perspective. So let's start in with some questions right out of the gate here. So Ross, what are some of the key characteristics of the various financing options that fleet managers and owners need to be aware of?
Well, I think the first important characteristic is to be aware that they can finance these vehicles with no out-of-pocket costs. So the financing structures that we offer are full turnkey, 100% financing. That includes the vehicle, all the accessories, charging infrastructure if that's needed. It's really designed to eliminate the upfront costs for the customer, which is usually the biggest hurdle that they have to get over. I would say that the second most important characteristic is that there is flexibility in how those financings are structured, depending on the type of commercial customer that we're dealing with. For example, a city transit authority versus a privately owned company. There's different characteristics to each of those markets.
Okay, and so when you're talking about those different markets, are they completely different avenues of acquiring the vehicles, whether it be leasing or financing, or maybe expand a little bit on what the public sector versus the private sector would be looking at there?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. There's really 3 credit types that we deal with. The first we refer to as C&I, which is commercial and industrial clients. Those are privately owned companies or publicly traded companies, for-profit entities. And the second market that we deal with is nonprofit entities. Those can be 501c3 nonprofits like the American Red Cross, for example. It could be a private school or college, university, that type of customer. And then the final category is what we refer to as the tax-exempt market, which is typically city, county, or state government entities or related entities like public school districts, for example. Jails, museums, anything that's connected or an entity that's part of that governmental. So that's the tax-exempt market, sometimes referred to as muni or municipal space. But each of those categories, the general structure of financing can be the same, but the terms and conditions are slightly different. The credit underwriting process can be a little bit different. And then the form of document, especially in the tax-exempt space, is different than the C&I space because there's certain characteristics of that document, including what's called a non-appropriations clause, for example. So it's a very specific type of document that we use in the tax-exempt space.
Mm-hmm. So is this something that this sounds? I'm a marketing guy, right? Not a finance guy. So this sounds fairly
Right.
confusing. But this is something that we here at Lightning, you in particular, can help our customers or prospects navigate this confusion. Correct?
Yes, certainly. That's really the role that I'm excited about, is communicating with the customer early on to, number one, to inform and educate what the financing options are that are available, what the process looks like to get to, for example, just a simple budgetary quote. Again, is the customer looking for a level monthly payment over a fixed term, seasonal payments? We just go through that kind of, what's available? Educate the customer as to what's available, and then really learn from the customer what is the best fit for them. What have they done in the past? What are they comfortable with? What are they familiar with? Because you'll find that each customer you deal with usually has experience with equipment leasing and financing. So there's usually a path that they're familiar and comfortable with. I just like to discover what that is so that I know what target we're aiming at.
Right, and I'm sure it's not just a matter of which ones they're comfortable with, but I'm sure everyone, many different customers and prospects have different goals associated with how they want to approach the financing piece,
Sure.
whether that be financing or leasing, or does it include the chargers, does it not include the chargers, all aspects of
Right.
that as well. Yeah.
Well, and many times we're dealing early on with fleet managers who may or may not be the decision maker when it comes to the economics of the deal or how that transaction is going to be financed. So my job is to really arm that fleet manager with as much information as possible about what financing options are available, and then hopefully get the opportunity to have a meeting with that financial decision maker to understand their perspective on how the financing needs to be structured, and kind of take it forward from there.
All right, great. All right, well, so let's move on to the next question then. What are some of the common misconceptions about financing, or maybe the unknowns? For example, I hear a lot when I'm talking to folks, that the biggest challenges are around residual values. What else?
Sure.
Can speak to that maybe specifically and a little broader on what are the other challenges there?
Right. Yeah. Well, you mentioned residual values. That's simply because there's no blue book at this point on used commercial electric vehicles. So, however, there are structures that we can do. We can take residual risk. It's just not to the degree that if there were a blue book, you could target towards that. And again, depending on the form of document, there's a document called a track lease, which stands for Terminal Rental Adjustment Clause, that simply states that the customer and the lender agree on what that residual value is at the end of 3 years, say. And if the customer elects to return the equipment and the lessor then has to liquidate the equipment, the customer would be responsible for any shortfall on the sale. Or if the vehicle actually sells for more than what that agreed upon residual value is, the proceeds, the net amount above that would go back to the customer in the form of a rental adjustment. That's why it's called a terminal rental adjustment clause. But I think some of the big misconceptions is that, grants are maybe the most preferred way to go, but not everybody is going to get one of those grants. So having an alternative form of financing is a very proactive strategy. And also the fact that, any of these financings can be combined with grants and incentives. And we really, there are a lot of options that I don't think folks really consider. And if you look at the business proposition, as you said, the operating cost for electric vehicles is far less than it is for internal combustion engines. So it's not too dissimilar from energy efficiency, where we're basing the economic justification in part on the savings. So it's going to be interesting for, I think, each customer to take a look at that and see how much they're saving, and then combine that with the financing and any incentives that are available, and just take a look at it at the big picture of what the actual total cost of ownership is. Probably another, I would say in the smaller municipal markets, for example, charter schools, small school districts that use type A buses, they may just not be aware of the fact that 100% financing is available for electric vehicles. So, I'm excited about that whole education process and letting the customer know what the options are. But I think just general awareness, especially with, if they're not in the finance department, they're in the fleet department, they may not be aware of what all of the finance options are.
Right. And that kind of carries over onto the funding side as well. I mean, on the school bus side, not only could they be fully financed, but the bus might be free with the funding side. So they might just be looking at a portion of the charging infrastructure or something, which makes it very, very reasonable at that point. It sounds like there's lots of options here for most of the fleets that are out there. Again, one of the things that I hear frequently is, well, the upfront cost is just too much. But it sounds like there really are a number of options that make the transition and to take advantage of the total cost of ownership reduction, a very viable option then.
Yeah, I think that's really, as long as I've been doing this, it's been our number one objective. Is it's a lot easier to convert to new technology without the upfront cost. And so you pay for the technology as you use it, not upfront. That's always been the goal of having a good equipment leasing option. And again, all of these programs are designed for ultimate ownership by the customer. So that's probably another misconception, Nick, is that some people hear the word lease and they think, they're going to have the vehicle for a couple of years and then have to turn it in or have mileage restrictions or other restrictions. We're talking about leases intended for ownership. So that's a key for a misconception when some people hear the word lease. But when we talk about it, it's lease for ownership.
Probably a residual of a lot of the people that have experienced passenger vehicle leasing in the past, myself included.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
All right. So another question: what are some of the typical underwriting costs and interest rates at this point? I'm sure that's a moving target with today's economy.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you know, we've had multiple increases in rates over the past 12, 13 months. However, I will tell you that, I feel it's still very affordable. I mean, and we take each of those categories, I'm really going to talk commercial and industrial. One of the things that there's some variance in, credit quality, transaction size, but in general, we still have access to capital for commercial and industrial deals in the, 6.5, 6.75, which is a full 100 basis points less than the prime lending rate, up to about 8.75, which is, prime plus one. That's typically the market that we're going to be in for commercial and industrial. On the nonprofit and tax exempt side, obviously tax exempt is going to have the best cost of funds. We're seeing right now rates in the 4 to 5% range for tax exempt deals. And then on a nonprofit, it depends how they're categorized, but it could fall into either of those rate categories, tax exempt or C&I. So I would broadly brush that on nonprofits in the, say, 5 to 7.5% range. So, we're in the single digits, which is, very attractive considering that SBA 7A loans right now are at 10.75, plus they have a 3% or up to a 3%. So generally 2 or 3% underwriting fee. Our underwriting fee is zero. We don't charge any underwriting fees, and our documentation fees are very minimal. In most cases, under $1,000, and in a lot of cases, under $500. So it's truly no cost up front, no underwriting fees, and we get the best possible cost of funds for our customers.
Okay, great. That's all the questions I had. Did you have any final comments that you'd like to convey to our listeners today?
Yeah, I would just like to kind of relate a story of a transaction that we're currently working on with a customer, and doing that customer interview and then the economic justification. We're in that particular transaction where I learned that we're replacing rental equipment that the customer is currently paying $600 to $700 a week, plus fuel, plus mileage. And his total rental cost was roughly $4,000 a month, including fuel and the mileage charges. And our target for the monthly payment on his transaction is between $1,500 and $1,600 a month. So that's it's $2,500 net savings per month. Makes the economic justification on that very compelling, and it's a very attractive scenario. He's eager to really convert his fleet. Very interesting deal, and that's why I stay in this business, is because each deal has its own characteristics, and it's fun to explore how the customer is going to benefit from converting the fleet to electric.
Right. And, then we get beyond all the financial pieces. Not only are we getting reduced costs associated with it, but you're also getting the reduced emissions, which at the end of the day is why we're doing all of this, right? We're not doing this we are doing this for our health, I guess is the best way to put it, right?
Right. No, absolutely.
Right. Great. Well, thank you, Ross. I appreciate your time today, and I'd like to thank all of our listeners as well for taking the time to listen to our podcast. I'd encourage you all, again, to go out and look at listen to the other 5 podcasts in the series of Fleet Electrification Equation, and we hope to see you again on a future episode of Lightning EV Talk. Have a great day.